On financing the SDGs, privatization, and human rights. We're really grateful that you come out in the middle of the winter to hear Jeffrey Sachs and Philip Alston talk about this. Really important topics for development. So this should be a really good discussion. My name is Brooke Guven. I'm a researcher with the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, and I'll be guiding the discussion tonight. And I just at the outset want to thank the other co-sponsors for this event, which are the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, the Columbia SEPA MPA in Development Practice Program, the Human Rights Institute, the Institute for the Study of Human Rights and Rights Links. So thank you very much. The event tonight goes until 7:30. We'll start with a discussion between the two of them, and then we'll open it up and have sufficient time for Q&A. So please, think of your questions as we go along. And I should reference or note that the event's being recorded and will be made publicly available, just for FYI for the Q&A. If anyone wanted to ask a question, it will be available later. So I'm going to start tonight by introducing the only two people in the room who need no introduction. Jeffrey Sachs is the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on the SDGs. He's Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia and also of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which released a relevant report in late 2018 called Closing the SDG Budget Gap, and that's available online. Philip Alston is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. His most recent report criticized the extent to which international financial institutions and even the UN itself have aggressively promoted widespread privatization, including as a way to achieve the SDGs, without regard to the human rights implications or the consequences for the poor. Philip is also a professor at NYU School of Law and co-chair and faculty director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. So with that, we will get into our discussion. So Jeff and Philip, just to kick things off with a very small topic, and before we get into the sort of issues about financing the SDGs and privatization, I'd like to talk about sort of the two frameworks that we're starting with, the SDGs and the human rights framework. There are many shared goals and objectives between these two frameworks, but some also see less than full alignment. So Philip, if you could start us off, where do you see convergence and divergence between these two overarching frameworks?
Well, thanks, Brooke. I guess superficially there are immense similarities in the sense that human rights aims to eliminate poverty, to ensure education, healthcare, water, to promote gender equality, and a range of other issues, all of which are addressed very directly in the SDGs. If we look more closely, I put my human rights glasses on, what we see is that there are a number of references to human rights, but for the most part, I would characterize them as token references. When we start looking more closely at the substance, then I think we can see differences, but also potential complementarities, of course. If we take something like gender equality, the SDGs have a strong commitment. They are trying to measure aggregate improvements and so on. But of course, the human rights approach to gender equality is more, first of all, individual focused to make sure that the individual person is able to exercise their rights equally, but also more focused on I think a more rounded conception of substantive equality than one would necessarily get out of the SDGs. I think I'd add just one other dimension, which is that since they were adopted in 2015, it's hard to think that the human rights dimension has done anything but go backwards. In other words, with the ascendancy of China, particularly in the UN context, China is really flexing its muscles very significantly. It systematically opposes references to human rights in the development context, except for its own very particular focus on the right to development, which is not, in fact, a human rights approach. So what we're seeing in practice is a greater division, actually, between efforts to promote the SDGs, which of course are incredibly important, but efforts to do so while also promoting respect for human rights.
Thank you. Jeff, I'll let you respond to Philip and talk about how you see the SDGs and human rights.
Basically, we've been rhetorically at the same objective since the establishment of the United Nations itself. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights established rights to health, education, livelihoods, social protection, and said at the time in 1948 that these are human rights for all, but that they will be only progressively realized, that this would take time. And it's taking a lot of time. But what the UN has done in various ways, both within the human rights field specifically, and in various development initiatives dating back really to the 1960s, which was the so-called first decade of development, is to establish goals that are stated mainly in economic or social quantitative terms. And the UN member states keep doing this. So we have a fugue between formal human rights core canonical processes like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international covenants on economic, social, and cultural rights, a number of treaties that are associated with those. And then we have a development stream that started with the first decade of development in 1961. I printed out, because I wanted to refer to it, the second decade of development in 1971, which is when the goal of development aid of 0.7 of 1% of GDP was first enunciated. And when you read this document, which I haven't read in 30 years, it's exactly the SDGs. So we're just doing it again and again and again. Each developing country shall formulate its national employment objectives so as to absorb an increasing proportion of working population in modern type activities. Okay, we wouldn't use this language exactly now, but that's SDG 8. Particular attention should be paid to achieving enrollment of all children of primary school age. That's SDG 4, except now it's added to secondary. Each developing country should formulate a coherent health program for the prevention and treatment of diseases, raising general levels of health and sanitation. That's SDG 3 and SDG 6. Levels of nutrition should be improved in terms of average caloric intake and protein content, with special emphasis on the needs of vulnerable groups, SDG 2. The full integration of women in the development effort should be encouraged, SDG 5. So we keep stating these goals each decade, or now each 15 years, because the Millennium Development Goals were like this, and now we have the SDGs. There are differences in important, actually, updating, because the main update from all of this is the environmental dimension, which was not at all part of this agenda until really, essentially, a first conference in 1972, but the real meat of sustainable development started in 1992 at the Earth Summit. So I would regard these goals as, again, basic human rights. And they're not stated that way mainly because the United States, China, other countries don't want to state them in terms of human rights. And the human rights approach adds, I think, a measure of intellectual and moral discipline and a harder edge to this, because the SDGs, to say, well, every child should be in school or we should have universal health care, shouldn't be viewed as a favor or isn't that sweet. It's a goddamn human right. And it's been a human right since 1948. And why hasn't it been realized? Because we got a lot of greedy people that don't want to participate in helping to realize these rights. So I wouldn't say that there's a difference of these agendas. I think from Philip's point of view, not seeing the human rights language centrally is correct, because it's definitely downplayed as part of the negotiating process to get all countries, including the evil empire, that would be this one, to adopt this, because the last thing in the world, the United States doesn't even recognize economic rights, and really hasn't since Franklin Roosevelt died. And so the language is different, and the U.S. never signed the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So that's why the language is different, and I do think that the language of human rights here should add and should be the right to, this is not just a goal of universal health coverage, it is a human right, in repeated 25 times from the WHO Constitution, UN Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant, and countless other documents. So try enforcing it, that's a different matter. And when we look at the programmatic aspects of realizing these rights, I think that there are ways that we should be a lot harder-headed in how we think about that, because I personally, as I'm going to describe, don't think that the main failure is necessarily what would be the conventional exclusion or process issues, but really that poverty is a terrible barrier, and the rich are really nasty to the poor, in my view. And if we were really realizing human rights, we could have realized these rights 30 years ago. We could realize all these rights within the next few years, because we have ample resources to do it, but it requires the rich people and the rich countries helping to finance the poor people and the poor countries. And of course, that is the worst anathema to the United States imaginable. It's the last thing in the world that goes through Mr. Trump's head, and it's very thin capillaries there, so very little goes through. But it will never be part of this administration's idea. So this is our battle, in my view, that we can't realize these rights because the conditions for realizing them are about power to a large extent.
Did you want to respond at all, Philip, briefly?
Well, just to say, first of all, a very minor correction, the US did actually sign the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Jimmy Carter, at a certain point, signed both of the covenants, but signature, of course, doesn't...
But didn't ratify.
No, it didn't ratify.
So Senate didn't ratify.
Yes,
That's what I should
okay,
have been made clear.
Didn't amount to much, but
Yeah.
at least there was
Sorry.
a temporary window of openness.
Right.
I think one of the key things, and maybe we'll talk about this later, what human rights often means to me, most importantly in a way, is the concept of accountability, that governments are really able to be held to account. And one of the big differences that we've seen with the SDGs is this determination that they are voluntary commitments and that it will be done in accordance with national law and national priorities and so on, and a deep resistance to actually being held to account. Whereas in the human rights area, while there are many flaws, we could talk about all the shortcomings and so on, but at least in principle, even the United States, even Australia, where I come from, are at least formally held to account on a regular basis for what they've done or not done in the human rights area. But what we're seeing in the SDGs is that the annual high-level political forum exercise is not holding many feet to any fires.
Yeah, I think multilateralism, period, by the way, is on the verge of collapse if we're unlucky, and we might be unlucky. So we have a big problem to begin with. But the U.S. hasn't ratified anything of substance for 25 years now. So the U.S. Congress, every time it hears that any of its own ideas have been agreed by other countries, then says, well, then we're against it. So the most persuasive argument in the Senate is everyone else opposes it. Then you would get ratification of everything. But if you are told that all the other countries approve of something, whether it's rights of children, rights of women, biodiversity, climate change, the Senate absolutely refuses. And by the way, it's not just Trump, although he's a nut. It's actually deeply embedded in the U.S. System, and it has been for 25 years now. We don't agree on anything by law.
The perfect example of that is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
Exactly, which started with the U.S. law.
Writ large, yeah.
Yeah, the U.S. made the law. The other countries said, that's a great idea. Let's make a treaty. And the U.S. said, no. So, how dare you agree with us? Something must be wrong here. So there is this kind of paranoid streak, which is very dangerous, actually. But I would say the problem is the big powers are not accountable to anybody. And they're not accountable to the UN Charter anymore. And so we're really in a very bad way when the lead proponent of the UN Charter, which was the United States, is dead set against living under the UN Charter. And we're in the process, I don't like the government, but we're in the process of trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela in full, obvious, transparent process of regime change, completely against the UN Charter. And everybody in this country basically agrees with it. Both parties, no one says almost anything against it, and a lot of other countries agree with it also, actually, a lot of normally better behaved countries. And so this is, just to go to the point about enforceability, even if something is, I like the human rights idea that this is a right and it is law. But the United States could care less what the Human Rights Council says and walked out of it, if I understand correctly. So, and unfortunately, they don't care what special rapporteurs say about it also. So we're in a situation where it's just, we're at the margin of losing what we spent a long time to try to build, which was international norms that were higher than Donald Trump's morality. Because that morality is the morality of whatever power can mean in whatever moment. And there's not the slightest principle beyond that. And that's how we're operating right now. And I think that's true here too, with the SDGs, which, thank God, they don't even mention in Washington. Thank God. If you go to Washington, don't mention the SDGs, please. They never heard of them, so they're not trying to destroy them. So we're keeping it a secret outside of the Beltway, okay? So far, so good, not a word. Okay?
All right.
All right.
With that, I want to sort of turn to the next portion of things we'd like to discuss tonight, now that we've agreed on the alignment of human rights and the SDGs, which we can come back to later in the Q&A. But I want to talk about sort of financing the SDGs and the budget gap. We're hearing about the budget gap. We're not on track to meet the 2030 agenda, the goals articulated. Jeff, could you sort of break this down? How much is the gap? How are governments and other actors approaching the gap? And in the end, who is responsible for this gap?
To my mind, this is, for me, I'm been stuck on this issue, as Philip knows, for almost 20 years, or even longer than that, but since the Millennium Development Goals started, there is a basic problem that I think is a very important problem. If you look at a typical low-income country, and most of them are African countries right now, the general issue that is raised is, well, they govern badly, they're corrupt, they're untrustworthy, and so on. That's true of a lot of governments in the world, and including the United States, but for a poor country, it shows especially because governance also costs money, by the way, to have systems, to have trained people, to be able to operate with any kind of efficiency requires inputs, not just goodwill, even if you do or don't have it. But my problem has been for a long time a realization that came to me as I was trying to help some of the poorest countries, that the money's just not available to governments to do even the most rudimentary things. And you realize it when you're working with an impoverished country and they're collecting 20% of impoverishment. So 20% of GDP, where GDP is, say, $800 per capita, meaning that you have $160 per capita to spend on your population, and you're supposed to have health care, education, water, sanitation, power, business, agriculture, urban sustainability, rule of law, judiciary, parliament, and defense, police, whatever. And I can tell you the money doesn't go very far. $160 per capita is not really a lot of money to try to do all the things that are supposed to be done. And if you look at the United States, we're 20% of 20 trillion, of 60,000 per capita, 20 trillion aggregate. So 60,000 per capita is $12,000 per person that the federal government has. And then state and local government has another 6,000 per capita roughly. So it's about $18,000 per person per year for health, education, and so on. And we're not doing the greatest job of it in this country, but still that goes a lot farther than $160 per person per year. So my problem has been for a long time that, oh my God, this is poverty. And yet the world is rich. And so I want the rich world to pay for the poor world to be able to implement these things. Within these poor countries, there's usually a lot of protest against their quite insufficient governments. Understandable, because the governments aren't delivering basic goods and services. But I want the attention to go to the U.S. government, which is not doing its fair share of helping the poorest countries. Or I want the attention to go to the billionaires who, by the way, the best thing of our campaign season is we're seeing what a bunch of prima donna ignoramuses they are. So we see them fully in view now, which is their wealth is not commensurate with their intelligence. It is commensurate with their extraordinary good luck or bad behavior at some point. But
does this mean you're backing the campaign of the Starbucks?
Howard Schultz. My God, that lasted the length of one coffee cup. So his campaign's over. And maybe Michael Bloomberg will get a hint also. We don't want billionaires to be president of the United States right now. We already have one, and it's just about the worst thing that's ever happened to this country. I shouldn't say that. So many bad things can happen with him that haven't happened yet. But my point is, just to close this little soliloquy, we cannot realize these rights in a in an environment in which there are no international transfers. That's the bottom line. In other words, where there's no sense of normal transfers from the rich to the poor. And I'll take 2 more minutes to explain this perspective. All of our governments in the world, basically all governments in the world, raise at least 10% of GDP to provide the goods within their countries. All high-income countries raise from 30 to 55% of GDP. And that means many thousands of dollars, and a lot of that in the high-income world is redistributional to ensure universal services. So there's an effective redistribution. At the global level, we don't have any international taxes. And of course, the United States theme would be we'd go to war much faster than pay an international tax. The only thing we have of transfers at the international level is development assistance. That averages 0.3 of 1% of the income of the rich countries. So that's the sum total of what we call the global community. So the first hint is there's no community, okay? No community. There is a tiny financial transfer. And if we're going to make it as a planet, we need to actually have a transfer that is not even 0.7, which is the goal that was set back in 1970, but 2 or 3 or 4% of GDP routinely as part of an international scene for financing. But we don't do that, and so all these hopes for realization of rights in the poorest countries are unfortunately impossible, even if those governments were run magnificently well. And the final point I'll make is that economists tend to think, well, you're poor because you've screwed up. And that, unfortunately, is not true. You're poor for many, many reasons of history, bad luck, geography, and you screwed up. But in rich countries, you've screwed up a lot, but for all of those other reasons, you're still rich. Also because you beat the hell out of poor countries at the right moments, and you had what used to be called the primitive accumulation of capital, which meant you had slaves, you had exploitation, you grabbed other people's resources, and the United States still tries to do this, but it doesn't succeed. It wastes a lot of money and costs a lot of lives, but it doesn't actually grab anybody's resources effectively anymore.
I think you probably have a response to this, Philip.
Well, I served on Jeff's task force way back on the Millennium Development Goals, representing the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I've always been very sympathetic to his determined agenda to ensure stronger transfers, greater solidarity, and so on, and I think that is still a big challenge. I have to say, though, that in my own thinking, I've probably moved to a different point where it seems to me that the victory, if I can put it that way, of the neoliberal agenda is actually the biggest obstacle. In other words, the assumption that governments should be as small as possible and that they should be able to perform as fewer functions as possible. The assumption that taxation is a bad thing and that every state should be reducing as much as possible its taxation. The issue of privatization that we'll be talking about later, where again governments are trying to outsource any responsibilities that they had. And all of this being inspired by a philosophy, if that's the right word, of basically you're on your own. Don't think you're in a community, don't think there are collective responsibilities, and don't think the government is there to help you. So if we accept that those values are increasingly dominant in most countries around the world, in fact, then the hope that governments are suddenly going to show solidarity with other governments, that they're going to be motivated to make significant transfers in order for poor developing countries to achieve things that they no longer believe are rights. You Americans shouldn't have a right to health care because that's a violation of the free market. It's filthy socialism, and we're going to protect you from that. But therefore, neither should people in developing countries have this. So it seems to me that at the same time as pursuing Jeff's agenda, we also have to look at the sort of basic values that are being embraced and that are being promoted, particularly by a lot of the international institutions.
Yeah, I think, it's really, that's 100% correct. I agree completely with that. But again, we should look at, we've been in the U.S.-dominated world basically since 1945. It's coming to an end, whether it comes to an end with chaos or comes to an end with something coherent or comes to an end with something actually nice is the biggest battle of the international scene right now. But the international institutions, the ones that have been important in this, the two most important ones have been the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. And the most important thing to understand about those is their geography again. The World Bank is at 18th in Pennsylvania, and the IMF is at 19th in Pennsylvania. So if you consider the 4-block stretch, at 15th in Pennsylvania is the Treasury. At 16th in Pennsylvania is Donald Trump. At 17th in Pennsylvania is the Executive Office Building. At 18th in Pennsylvania is the World Bank. And at 19th in Pennsylvania is the IMF. So a lot of what we see is American power deployed responsibly or irresponsibly. And I would say for the last 40 years, quite irresponsibly. And the neoliberal agendas, it's a good question, actually, whose agenda exactly it is. It's surely the American power structure agenda. This is for sure. And I've had 40 years of life with it, doing economic advice alongside these institutions, so I've seen a lot. So it's definitely the U.S. Who else is quite interesting? Australia, good friends. So definitely the Anglo-Saxon world is part of this. So I would say UK, US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the Five Eyes, the intelligence world. This is the English-speaking core of this agenda. Of course, no one else is as extreme as this as the empire itself, which is the US. Canada, and I think it's good to calibrate this a little bit. Australia, I believe, has universal health coverage, basically. And Australia's tax take is, I think, something like 35% of GDP. The US, 30% of GDP. UK, 35% of GDP. Canada, 37% of GDP. I don't know New Zealand. The Anglo-Saxon world is the closest among the developed countries to this kind of let the markets do it. And it goes back to the British Empire and British imperial rule, and also to British liberalism, Mill onward. Europe used to have a different view, and Matt, you could tell us whether it still does, but Europe, continental Europe, taxes 40 to 50% of GDP. And it would never subscribe to neoliberalism as a doctrine. Even the center right in Europe is to the left of the center left of the United States. So the center right in Europe would basically be aghast at what a moderate Democrat would say in the United States, which would seem completely neoliberal to them, not to mention the extremes of what the Republican Party stands for, which is really to say to everybody, just go to hell. Leave us alone. Leave us rich white people alone. And so Europe isn't quite on that line. And then the ideology in the developing countries is vast because you have 150 countries. And most of them are not neoliberal per se. They're just poor, unstable, and facing all sorts of difficulties, like how do we attract capital? Because if you want to look what New York City did to attract the Amazon headquarters, that's a good example. We said to Jeff Bezos, oh, you want a private heliport? No problem. You don't want taxes? No problem. You want free land? No problem. You want rebates? No problem. Okay, that's what every developing country has to do now also, because there's not only no solidarity on taxes, the whole world is designed by the U.S. precisely not to have solidarity on taxes. So they want this battle of mobile capital, and that's what we have. So I just agree fully with you, except to say that it is the kind of culmination of 50 or 60 years of U.S. governance, and the fact that since Reagan came to power, which was January 20th, 1981 at 10 a.m., we've been on a downslide. And the U.S. has governed on that basis, and we've had no progressive politics since that day, including Clinton, including Obama. It's been basically all right-wing from that moment, because you can't govern from the center-left. And because of the control of these institutions, we see what you're seeing. And, you know, Jim Kim, who just left the World Bank to join a private company 3 years early. I tried to be World Bank president, but Obama wasn't seeing it because obviously I would have been the last one he would have appointed, even though many, many countries supported. I did make a insurgent candidacy, which was fun because many governments supported me, and the White House, which was filled with my friends, would have shot me, but instead they just stabbed me in the back many times. But the reason that they did it is that you need the World Bank to implement U.S. politics. That's the whole idea of the World Bank. That's why it's at 18th and Pennsylvania, not someplace else. So it's literally to implement U.S. foreign policy. And I was obviously not a great candidate for doing that. I would have flunked that course from the first moment. And what Jim Kim was doing as World Bank president, even though he came from a background of progressive public health, he wanted exactly to privatize everything, and he kept giving speeches about how Wall Street's going to solve all these problems. And by the way, Davos last week, it was the best week because I didn't go, and I loved it. So we're going to try to have an anti-Davos, seriously, starting a serious anti-Davos. And I found a good location of it, which we'll be revealing shortly. Okay.
Not Brooklyn, I hope.
No, it's going to be in a warm place.
So we've talked a bit about, ODA, official development assistance, is not working. There's a failure to provide for adequate amounts of taxation. We're offering these massive incentives, which developing countries are feeling the need to compete with. Yet we do have these goals, we do have these needs. We listed them at the beginning: health, environment, everything else. So, many countries are now turning to privatization. And so, Philip, I would love to turn it over to you to talk about your report and how privatization is playing out and impacting human rights and their fulfillment.
Well, I've come only late to this game of privatization. In the human rights area, most of us have looked in a bemused way at privatization and thought, well, what's it matter? As long as people are getting health, as long as people are getting education, it's not such a big deal. I've started to change my views pretty dramatically, I'd have to say. And that's partly because what I see is that in the SDG context, for example, and the report Jeff did last year brings this out very nicely, there are a lot of different actors, the bank, lots of governments, and certainly private industry, by definition almost, are saying, listen, you'll never do it through governments. It's only if private actors get behind the SDGs that you're going to achieve any of these. And so therefore, we have to do it. And that then goes to the extreme that so ODA, official development assistance from governments, that should somehow be channeled through private business because we're going to be able to make better use of it. Philanthropic organizations, Ford Foundation, OSF, whoever, what you should be doing is not giving grants to governments and NGOs, but private enterprise, because that's the answer, privatization. And of course, the problem is that it's not. It may be the answer in some areas in terms of infrastructure or whatever, it may not be, but we need to start looking at it infinitely more critically. The classic example, it's a very small illustration, but I did an official UN visit to the United Kingdom a few months back. And one of the issues that wasn't really on my agenda before I went there, but loomed large as I started talking to people around the country, was transport. So in the UK, starting with the Thatcher Revolution, 1980, transport has been largely privatised, except in London. So those of you who go as tourists will have no problem. You've got the subway, you've got the bus system and so on. It's all supervised very carefully by the government, and it works. Once you get out into the countryside, transportation is entirely privatised. What happened was that a handful of large bus companies in particular forced out most of the small providers. They then decide, are they going to provide any routes between village X and village Y? If they do, will they do it more than once a day or just have it a couple of times maybe? And then will they charge £6 or £8 or whatever? And when I said to a government minister at one point, I've been talking to people in the villages and so on, one of their biggest gripes is transport. They can't afford to go to the places where there are employment. They can't afford to go to the hospital. They can't afford to go to government offices and so on. It's impossible for them. In many ways, they're being forced to buy automobiles, which they are very badly placed to be able to afford. And the government minister simply said, but it's not the role of government to provide transport. And that was it. And of course, at one level, he's right. The government doesn't have to provide transport. I shouldn't be able to phone up and say, hey, government, I need to get from X to Y, provide it. But a government needs to see basic infrastructure, whether it's water, whether it's sewerage, sanitation, etc., and essential transport as something that it needs to make happen. And it needs to regulate private providers in such a way as to make sure that people are not simply isolated, not cut off. But what I think we're seeing on a much broader scale, and Jeff mentioned already Jim Kim's marvellous contribution to the World Bank, which is essentially to say that we will only provide support to a public function if you, the government, can demonstrate that the private sector cannot or will not do it. So you've got a default option that everything should be privatised. And I think this, again, it's sort of symptomatic of the withdrawal of government. It's certainly chronic in human rights terms because what we see is that it's a technique that's used for basically eliminating human rights protections, because I, as a government, used to be responsible for the prison system. I used to be responsible for at least oversight of the education system, of the health system. But sorry, it's not me anymore. It's the Sachs Corporation. If you've got a problem with, your hospitals or healthcare, go and speak to the Sachs Corporation. And of course, when you get there, they're going to say, sorry, we don't actually accept complaints, and in any event, we don't have obligations of the type that government has. But when the government gave you the monopoly on this, or gave you the right to do this, you said that you would accept the various obligations. Yes, but of course, we're a private entity. You can't expect us to be doing that sort of thing. So what we're seeing is really systematic outsourcing of what used to be considered to be human rights obligations that governments held. And where the human rights area used to be looking at a broad spectrum of activities within a society, it's being shrunk constantly. And the corporate sector, which is the great beneficiary and driver of privatization, has nothing to do with human rights. So all of the guidelines, all of the standards that the World Bank and all the other investment banks and others have generated endlessly on privatization, how to make it socially responsible, how to make it environmentally sustainable, first of all, never mention the term human rights, which is convenient because human rights at least are concrete standards that can be identified, and instead just talk in very general terms which don't end up providing any serious constraint on the privatized entities to really be behaving consistently with human rights, let alone to be providing a lot of the basic services and facilities which are essential for a decent life. Again, as your report from last year points out.
I think it's helpful to try to map what should be private, what should be public, and what should be private and regulated, and to understand that we have a lot of institutional options and a lot of variation across sectors and a lot of history and experience and logic in this. Generally, if you want something universally applied, especially if you want it universally equitably applied, then the first, even the sine qua non of that is public financing of it. So if you leave healthcare to the markets, absolutely you will not end up with universal access to equitable quality healthcare. If you were to leave education to the markets, you would not end up with universal access to quality, equitable education services. So one criterion is universality. Things where people are making choices and it's not a universal good, not a human right, are much more readily left to the market because the market discriminates by income level. The second criterion is a standard one, which is correct, basically, is whether the service or the good that's being provided is a kind of monopoly or a public good, or something that can be provided on a relatively competitive market basis. And there, things like infrastructure, where you put power transmission lines, for example, that's not a competitive sector. That is a network, and you have one of those. So even in the United States, which is the most market capitalist economy of the major countries, the transmission lines are actually owned by not-for-profit NGO institutions and highly regulated ones, because it would make no sense to do otherwise. The highways, even in this country, are public. They're federal highways, actually. That was took a long time to be accepted in this country, but finally we built an interstate highway system as a federal project. So there's lots of infrastructure that cannot be private because it can't be competitive. It's a grid or a network. And what the UK did was privatize all of that and then try to regulate it. And it's been nothing but a mess because it's no advantage to be in a private hand, but highly regulated. And they've all gone bankrupt or been a mess to actually adjudicate and govern by those standards. I favored a lot of privatization in Eastern Europe 30 years ago because if you wanted to go to a really crummy hotel, go to a state hotel in Poland in 1989. It was just, do you really want your government running the hotels? No. Let them run the schools and the clinics. I did notice, by the way, that my mad government could not understand the difference of privatizing hotels and privatizing healthcare. But that's because the American power elite is crazy and corrupt. And so they couldn't draw the line. Not all privatization is wrong. Governments are really lousy at running most manufacturing firms. They're lousy at running shops. They're lousy at running services that are easily privatized where it's not a universal access thing. And those should be in private hands. But where this conundrum, or not conundrum, this really bastardization of basic public economics is coming in, is in things like healthcare, education, and basic infrastructure. So the United States is the only country that has a heavy private healthcare system in the rich world. And you can see the results of it because the other thing that privatization does is it allows for monopoly power when it shouldn't be competitive. We only have 2 or 3 main providers of healthcare services in New York City. They're all agglomerated. They've got tremendous market power anyway. And there are systems, networks. That's why, is your doctor in this or not in this? Can we go to this? It's crazy to run a system like this. And the US system is twice as expensive as anybody else's healthcare system in the whole world to get this mishmash of results and a very unfair access. So these are problems, but they're so profitable, the healthcare industry. This is an incredibly successful industry from the point of view of making money. And by the way, also for the so-called not-for-profit. Not-for-profit healthcare in the United States just means mega salaries. Look at what the Columbia Healthcare high honchos make or Mount Sinai. I think many millions of dollars to run the system. In Sweden, this would be impossible to, a local healthcare hospital manager would probably make 100 to 200,000 euro equivalent, something like that. Here, at least a couple $1 million because it's a monopoly and with a large amount of public reimbursement. So it's really good to analyze what should be done, which we fail to do here because there's a lot of money to be made. And it is driven by Wall Street, which is the worst of this because there's no values on Wall Street other than the bottom line. And that's how all of Wall Street is designed right now, which is maximize the returns, period. Don't talk to me about anything else. Lives saved, access, health care, and so on. And that is something we should try to change because they're close to your office. So we should go march on them again when the weather warms up a little bit. And we should try to reoccupy Wall Street, actually, and get it done right this time. And this time, unlike Bloomberg, I don't think de Blasio would kick us out of Zuccotti Park. So I think we should think about that.
So, if,
I like that idea, by the way. I don't think de Blasio would kick us out, actually.
So,
But it's got to be a little warmer. Okay.
Come back in 3 months, we'll do it again. So, the SDGs, the Addis Agenda, these all envision a role for the private sector. And it does seem to be saying that, the hegemonic powers and the World Bank and others are sort of going overboard with that. So how do we roll that back? What do we do? How do we stop privatization, or how do we realign privatization with how it should be aligned within Sustainable Development Goals and human rights frameworks? Philip, if you wouldn't mind.
It's an easy question. I think just a footnote to what Jeff was saying, one of the things that has really struck me is the systematic and remarkably successful efforts of the Trump administration to roll back all of the environmental and health and other regulatory protections. And of course, we hear constantly from the corporations which are objecting to all of that and saying this is making vulnerable people infinitely more vulnerable. This is going to cause lots of deaths down the road. We need some of these regulations. I'm being facetious, of course. If you can point me to a single large corporation that has made any comment about the rollback of any of these regulations, all of which were hard fought for, all of which represented the culmination of scandals of large numbers of people being poisoned, whose lives have been ruined, and finally there's regulation adopted at the federal level, and all simply rolled back, and corporations saying, great, and there's still some more, let's roll them back as well. So I think I don't actually, in a way, have a jaundiced view of the corporate world. I think they're out for profit. That's fine, all in favour of that. But that simply means that we shouldn't then be looking to them as the engines for promoting what I would call human rights, particularly economic and social rights. I think we have to start at the beginning. I think we're seeing it in the United States. You've got to go back to notions. There is a goddamned right to health care. There is a right to education. And that right to education shouldn't be undermined by charter schools, privatization, or whatever other approaches are being pushed. I'm not saying you can't have charter schools, but you've got to look at the consequences. We've got to start being much more critical, scrutinizing what's going on, and seeing a lot of the privatization deals as sweetheart arrangements. Again, Jeff referred to the UK. One of the sectors that I looked at briefly when I was there but didn't have the time to go into it was water, which was all privatised back in England and Wales back again in the 1980s. The current situation in those countries is absolutely parlous. Expenses have gone up enormously. The privatised entities have stacked the water authorities with huge debt while taking really high salaries, a couple of million or whatever, while paying back very large dividend to shareholders. And what is on the what's on the horizon for England and Wales with water is either forced renationalisation, not forced by a Corbyn government, but forced by the impending collapse of all of the different authorities, or else a massive transfer of more resources from the government to the private entities. And all of this money is then flowing into the large corporate interests without any regard to what's going on. But there isn't nearly enough scrutiny of these sorts of things. There isn't nearly enough pressure put on governments to say you have basic obligations to make sure that these needs are met. And I think we do have to go back to the basics. To just finish on the SDGs, I think it's very easy. It's an easy way out to say, oh, well, governments are not providing any more money. We're going to still retain the goals of the SDGs, but we're going to have to look to the private sector because it ain't going to happen. You know, it's going to work for a certain number of things, as Jeff said. It's certainly going to work for people like us. The elites are going to benefit from privatization. I'll be able to get the best services I want in everything. But for the bottom 20%, 30%, whatever, privatization ain't going to work and the SDGs ain't going to be realized. So we have to start pushing back against what is the sort of accepted wisdom these days, that that's the way to go.
Yeah, I think this is a huge fight right now. And I think the human rights language can be very powerful politically. I don't think the human rights institutions necessarily will be decisive. No. But I think the human rights language needs to be brought to the forefront. And that these are basic rights, and they've been recognized as basic rights, because that language resonates, and it's true, and the SDGs actually, strangely, were agreed by all governments. The Paris Climate Agreement was agreed by all governments. So there, and that reflects a universality that is understandable, but is being defeated. We're not winning. And by the way, with the SDGs, everywhere I go in the world, in the UN work also, the SDGs are there, and people are talking about them and so on. But I doubt that almost anything different has happened because of the SDGs, whether they're there or not. Unlike with the Millennium Development Goals, where we had a few fragile but important breakthroughs at the beginning. For example, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria was a child of the Millennium Development Goals, which came early on and actually has shown that this idea of taking a chunk of money and actually putting it to saving lives really works. It's not a myth. It really works. Millions of lives have definitely been saved. We haven't had anything like that with the SDGs, and that's partly the Trump era, but it's partly the more general era that the aspirations of governments to do anything is extremely weak. Europe is divided, suffering from also the right-wing populist backlash, the refugee crisis, which was caused by an American-led regime change operation in Syria. The U.S. is miserable. Russia is miserable. So we're not seeing any actual change on the ground. So the question is what to do, and it's fundamentally a political challenge. What I like about the little bit of development that's happening here that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez represents, and it's kind of amazing, the voice, we are seeing the billionaires really discredited. And it's fun watching this, and important, actually, because not only are they not the heroes, they need to be taxed. And we're talking about wealth taxes, and then watching Bloomberg go all shuddery, oh, you'll make us Venezuela if you do that. Okay, Michael, you just exposed yourself for what you are. Sorry. That's really a jerky statement. And you should be the first to say with your $50 billion, I'd be happy to pay that because I understand my responsibility. And the fact that you didn't say that, in my opinion, completely disqualifies you as anybody that we would like to lead this country. So thank you for going on the record. Howard Schultz, even more of a dolt than I imagined, because he got great Starbucks everywhere. I do go to Starbucks a lot. I appreciate it. The coffee is actually good, to my taste anyway. But God, what a dimbo in his answers for the basics of what our society needs. So what may be happening is a social reaction which Trump grabbed at the beginning. Trump as the leading the forces for the dispossessed. Sad, pathetic, tapping every worst instinct that can be tapped, but maybe that will disappear. Maybe he'll go to jail. Maybe many other things will happen, which should happen. And maybe we'll have a real response that says these are human rights, these are basic rights, and we're not beholden to all of these powerful, rich forces, which actually are more powerful than the governments, which are basically on the take from the same few people. And so maybe nobody will show up to Davos next year. That would be a good campaign. Don't go, because we don't like what you're delivering for the last 25 years. It has not delivered. And I've gone for 20 years watching this, 25 years actually, and nothing good ever comes of it. That's not quite true. There was one discussion which helped with the Global Fund in 2001. After that, I don't remember anything good coming out of it. But we need a political reaction, and I do think that the language of human rights needs to be a core of this, because it's powerful. It's more powerful than saying it would be great. It's more powerful to say it's the right of everybody. And so we should really bring that to the forefront. But this is more politics than judicial right now. Sure. This is really going to the core of a system that is not in control. And the interesting thing is, at least for me, the U.S. has, been a bad actor, in my opinion, for the last 40 years, 38 years to be precise, since Reagan became president. But the world is changing, so this is a global politics, and the world does not depend on the U.S. Amazingly, the U.S. still has the power to destroy countries, one after another, like we're doing in many places in the world, bringing economies to their knees, trying to fight with China now, creating a tremendous mess in a lot of places. But the world's much bigger than the U.S., so the chance for a global movement around the human rights to health, education, decent livelihood, social protection, as long-established rights that have not been fulfilled by powerful governments and by an elite of 2,000 billionaires with $10 trillion of wealth and more power than imaginable. That strikes me as a viable campaign.
All right, well, thank you. I will start the Don't Go to Davos campaign. My invitation keeps getting lost. Yeah. I'll be the first on that list. I do want to open it up to questions for the last 20 minutes or so that we have. And if I could ask, as this is being recorded, when you ask a question, if you could ensure your mic is on, you'll see the button and the red light will go on just so we can record it or catch what you say. And I'll take a group of questions and allow then a response. I saw the hand in the back. Gentlemen, please.
Oh, there we go. Hi, thanks for coming and speaking with us. There's three things that both of you talked about with respect to deregulation, one being corruption or like regulatory capture, one being a pervasive ideology, and one being maybe as a path of least resistance or cost to accomplishing something. Are there any of the three of those that you think are maybe more of a root cause than the others? And if not, is there anything that you would put forward as a possible or probable root cause?
Let me take a couple more questions. Yes, in the front.
Hi, thank you very much for, I think, enlightening but certainly depressing presentation. I used to be the senior vice president and general counsel of the World Bank, so a lot of this is plus a chance, plus shows. The one I want to lead up to back to Brooke's first question, which has to do with, if not the dichotomy, the separation between economic development, which SDG has, and human rights. In many of our discussions, when we all talk about various things on development, we say such and such, except China, right? China was the main engine that allowed us to meet Millennium Development Goal number 1, right? By halving the extreme poor by half. Yet they're one of the worst perpetrator of human rights violations. So what you have is an accomplishment on the one and a total disaster on the other. So I'd like you to comment on that, because China is being looked at as a model these days.
Thank you. Let me take one more question. Yes, on the end. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for presentation. I have a question. If we try to involve transnational cooperation to financing sustainable development goal, yes, if we try to involve transnational corporations or business to financing sustainable development goals, does it not presuppose a certain level of privatization? How should we balance between these two types of necessary, in my understanding, logically connected processes? Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question on the root cause of issues we've talked about, the separation and issue of China, and then TNCs and balancing privatization. Anyone, either of you, feel free to jump in.
Why don't you start? Those are so easy. Okay.
Well, going backwards, corporate financing, I mean, obviously, corporations are central to our modern economy, or postmodern economy. What we need is a balance whereby governments retain their ultimate regulatory authority and corporations are enabled to use their resources in order to achieve agreed objectives. But privatization risks outsourcing the determination of what the objectives are. It leaves governments almost powerless often to change the priorities, and it marginalizes the whole democratic system, because if your governments have no money, no tax revenues, what's the point? Doesn't matter who you have, which party you have, they're not going to be able to fundamentally change the priorities because corporations are doing it all. So I think there is a very constructive partnership which needs to be had, but it shouldn't be as one-sided as it tends to be. On the China issue, I mean, unfortunately I could speak at great length on that because I did an official UN mission to China a couple of years ago. The question I was always asked is, but why did the Chinese invite a human rights special rapporteur? And indeed, after I came back, the High Commissioner then said to the Human Rights Council, and please, China, why don't you invite me? You let in this special rapporteur, but you don't let others in. And the explanation, of course, was simple. China wanted to show off its immense achievements in terms of poverty eradication, and so they invited me. And so the report card that they got was 50-50, that they have actually achieved unbelievable progress in terms of poverty alleviation. They demonstrate a genuine political commitment, which is rare across the world, to really make sure that people are no longer living in extreme poverty. I got a lot of pushback, people saying, yeah, but they're only doing it to prolong the life of the Communist Party. And I said, yeah, and other politicians don't adopt policies in order to prolong the life of their party, do they? If only other political parties would do it for the same reason, prolong your power by eliminating poverty, that would be great. But of course there is the other side of the China experiment, which is that it remains an authoritarian regime. It's been cracking down viciously against some of the people that I met when I was there, for example. And it's now promoting very much that recipe, which is, don't worry about human rights, guys, they're not important. What you need is development. The way in which you can best get development is to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is starting to look remarkably like old-fashioned American-style imperialism, where you lure countries into huge debt and then start calling in your political IOUs. And I think China is not going to play a very positive role in the development world, in the development sphere in the years ahead, even though it is extremely powerful thanks to its great wealth and the success of its domestic model to date.
So let me also give some thoughts on the three very good questions. On this deregulation, I think there is mostly a political economy factor, which is that there are large incentives for those who are advocating the deregulation to make more money and to pollute more and not have to clean up after themselves. There is one aspect which makes the regulatory strategies quite complex, though, and that is the speed of technological change right now. So we're in an absolute, obviously an absolute revolution of information technology. And we don't have good guidelines on a lot of complicated subjects. Now, it's pretty clear that companies like Facebook and Google have gotten way out of line on how they're operating and are very abusive and threatening to our rights and even our freedoms. But the rate of technological change poses a lot of questions about how to promote the good aspects of that and not stifle them, and at the same time how to stop abuses. And we're obviously not finding the right formula. But the main thing I would say is political economy of all of those factors. On the role of the private sector in the economy and in the SDGs, I think it's important to keep it simple in a certain way. And I have a four-pronged test that I like to apply in my own mind on companies. First, is what you're producing good or bad for the world? When it's coal, oil, and gas, it's bad for the world. It needs to be phased out. So if it's fast food junk, which is obesogenic, it's bad for the world. So you don't get any points for being Coca-Cola, in my view, or a lot of the terribly damaging fast food companies, or being ExxonMobil or Chevron and so forth. Second test is your value, are your direct operations causing profound damages to others, legal or not legal, and mainly environmental and social. Are you grabbing land? Are you polluting? Is your value chain, is your operation environmentally unsound? Third, you're part of a value chain. Our legal structure does not help us to police global supply chains. You chop up responsibility, and so downstream users don't have too much responsibility for upstream abuses or vice versa. And I think we need a legal framework much more attuned to global supply chains than we have right now. This is not an original observation, but it's an unsolved problem. But companies should be responsible for everything happening both upstream in their supplier side and downstream to their customers. And that is absolutely not the... And the fourth standard is, are you a good citizen? Do you obey the law? Companies generally, a lot of companies regard breaking the law as a probabilistic event and a cost of doing business rather than a normative idea. And do you pay your taxes? And almost nobody pays their taxes in large corporations. And the whole system is set up for massive tax avoidance, which is really substantively tax evasion. So I don't want heroism of these companies. I want them to stop creating damage. They're just creating a lot of damage. And then on China, I want to hold it a little bit more provisional on things like the Belt and Road, because Belt and Road is their big international initiative. I personally don't regard it as a predatory policy or designed to trap countries in debt. Maybe I'm naive, but I actually don't think that that's what this is about. I think what it's about is China arriving at maybe the properly measured the largest economy in the world and the largest trading country in the world, and at a stage of development where it's natural, you make a world network right now, like Japan did in Southeast Asia 35 years ago, and like the United States did after World War II. And I think China's basically doing that right now. Not in the best way, by the way, and a lot of unsophisticated projects and a lot of good projects as well. So it's really a mix of pretty mediocre, average quality. But I don't think that it is, I don't like to use the word neocolonialism or crypto-colonialism, or I really don't think that it is that. But it also may be a lot of lousy projects. For example, China should not be building Pakistan's coal-fired power plants. This is just horrible. It should not be building Bangladesh's coal-fired power plants. And with China, it's very opaque. Who, if anybody, is controlling that? That's part of Belt and Road, but a lot of nice words, but not green, for example, not sustainable. And so I'm not ready to give up on this, or I don't actually want to vilify it either, because I think it's basically the right and sound idea. And I don't think it is a predatory trap. And I really dislike the U.S. approach to China, which I think is, by the way, the American paranoid style, which is that now every day China's called the enemy routinely. By the way, this wasn't true 2 years ago. China was then, 3 years ago, China was a friend, a partner. 2 years ago was a competitor. Last year was a strategic competitor. Now it's just the enemy. This is very dangerous. And we're probably, the Chinese negotiations are taking place in Washington these couple of days. Maybe, as with Chairman Kim, Donald Trump will say, I love China, everything's great, we solved all the problems, and Donald Trump's fantasy world could be our fine result. But I think it's more likely that we're entering into a kind of Cold War with China. And this vilification of Huawei, by the way, which is going on, is extremely dangerous, in my opinion. And by the way, no one even says, oh, we have any evidence or proof. It's the system itself now. If we go down that road, we stand a good chance of getting all of us killed, by the way. And I say that in the following sense. We think of the Cold War as this great, and Americans think of the Cold War as this great effort that by persistence finally ended the Soviet Union. This is a long subject. I think that's the wrong understanding of the whole enterprise. But what I would say about the Cold War is that we nearly blew up the world on several occasions. And not to mention blowing up a lot of countries in the meantime, all through Southeast Asia, through Latin America, in the name of the Cold War. So if we start this campaign that it's the US, Europe, Australia, Japan against China and its allies, this would be insane. And we're just on the verge of doing that right now. And I think that therefore, I'm very cautious about vilification of China, first of all. I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think it's right. China is not doing anything perfidious by lending money to other countries, in my view, trying to build infrastructure and so on, though what they're building is not so great, unfortunately. It could be a lot improved. China is a great power that, in my opinion, deserves respect and cooperation. And if we go down the road of trying to create blocks, and we're about to do that, and I don't understand Europe, but Europe is exactly adopting all of this in these days, either because they're pathetically vulnerable and under the U.S. security umbrella, or because Europe lost the capacity to have a foreign policy, or some combination of these. This is very, very dangerous. And so I take a different view of China, which is that we ought to be absolutely strenuously trying to cooperate right now, because the future of the world depends on us cooperating, not us having a showdown.
Can I just say one word? I don't disagree with you in terms of the new Cold War. I don't disagree with you in terms of how ill-advised the current confrontation is. But I would actually push back quite strongly on the Belt and Road. If you take the case studies about which we have some information, of which there are all too few, because it's all secret. If you take what happened in Sri Lanka, if you look at what happened in Malaysia, overthrown only by the elections, if you look at what's happening in Kenya, what you've got, if you look at what's happened in various countries of West Africa, you've got totally secret loans for vast amounts of money being made often to completely non-democratic presidents or whoever, who are essentially mortgaging the futures of their countries. They are pocketing the billions now. They are signing on for what are often white elephant projects, huge railroad projects that don't add up when you look at the economics of them, as in Kenya and so on. And China is linking that to the extraction of mineral resources and to the ability in certain contracts then to take over key strategic locations. So I think the Belt and Road, for all of the nice way in which it's presented of linking China to the world and building trade routes and so on, actually has a really insidious component which is going to be problematic. That doesn't lead me to say China is bad, that it's a negative actor. I think all large countries have their problems, have their own self-interest that they're promoting. And it is ironic to see China acting as the United States did for so long in certain areas. But I don't think we should think that it's too early to start forming a pretty clear view of what Belt and Road means for a lot of countries.
I agree with a lot of that, but not with all of it in the following sense. Some of these projects are...
Look, it's a package deal. You either take it or leave it.
Right. Some of these projects are not good. The only thing that I stop at is the word insidious, actually. One view of this is that this is a dark plot. My view of China is that China is also very transactional. It goes with the ruling government. It's absolutely not fastidious about the rules. It's trying to get deals done, make influence. The Malaysia case is an example of, is pretty corrupt set of deals, and when Mahathir came in again, he closed everything up entirely, and it's bad behavior by China to have such crummy projects because the government wants them and it's convenient for the government. but I don't see it as insidious quite the same way. I don't see it as the plot to overtake Malaysia, but I do see it as a way to make deals, not deals designed to fail, a la Goldman Sachs and selling toxic assets, which is what is implied about Belt and Road, that it's designed to fail so we can grab all of these strategic sites. I just think that it's poorly governed in a lot of ways that you rightly described. But for a big and I don't think it is neocolonial. Neocolonial is the U.S. in having a CIA which overthrows governments. At least my understanding is that China's not doing that around the world. The U.S. is doing that around the world. That's been our foreign policy for half a century. If you don't like the government, overthrow it, which is different from if you don't like the government, find a way to deal with it or wait or do something else. And so, to my mind, colonial means you are directly manipulating the government. If China had been able to stop the Malaysian election because they were so influential that they said, no way we're having this change, that would be different. But I find what the U.S. does really neocolonial. In fact, we announced that one must go, like we're doing with Maduro right now in Venezuela, or like we said about Assad, or like we're threatening with Iran. And then we use strong-arm tactics, if not bombs and drones, to throw out the government. And that's, to my mind, neocolonial. I don't see China's behavior internationally that way at all. God help us if it becomes that way, because then we're really going to have a lot of trouble. But I don't see that that's a description. And so I think the U.S. is a much worse violator of international law than China is when it comes to the external behavior.
All right, well, we have come to the end of our allotted time. So unfortunately, I'm sorry, I can't take any more questions. We do have to leave, but I guarantee that they're both on Twitter. So feel free to fire away after we wrap up. Oh, just
No, I got off.
He's off Twitter. Philip's on Twitter. Direct all questions to Philip.